Résolution qui, selon nous, devrait mériter le soutien de tous les pays. Le Canada vous exhorte de l'appuyer. Nous avons écouté très attentivement dans cette Assemblée et au cours de nos conversations les préoccupations exprimées par tous les États membres. We were asked to address concerns about impacts on the least developed countries, about the discrimination against any refugee fleeing Ukraine, about the safety of foreign students, about food security, and the need to fully fund the UN's Global Humanitarian Response Plan. The resolution that has been tabled does just that, in addition to demanding the protection of civilians and safe and unhindered humanitarian access. There's been a suggestion, and we've heard it again today, that a humanitarian resolution should not say anything about the cause of the crisis or ascribe responsibility to any party. With great respect, Mr. President, we disagree. This is not a natural disaster. A humanitarian crisis of this type is not a spontaneous event. It didn't just happen. It happened because one country attacked deliberately, without provocation, another country. It is the direct result of a deliberate decision by the Russian Federation to invade Ukraine. To put it in simplest terms, we cannot talk about Moby Dick without mentioning that it's a whale. We can't do it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. We can't just set it aside and say that's of no importance. If we do not identify the aggressor and do not insist that it uphold its obligation to fully respect international law and comply with the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice, then I would argue we have failed to do our job. A ceasefire and a withdrawal of occupying troops is necessary to take the next steps. Le fondateur suisse de la Croix-Rouge internationale, Henri Dunant, fut aussi touché par la dévastation humaine sur le champ de bataille à Solferino qu'il a commencé son travail exemplaire menant aux principes fondateurs de l'aide humanitaire et aux aides et aux obligations de tous en temps de guerre. On dit que ses dernières paroles avant sa mort ont été la question « Où est l'humanité ?» Nous devons aujourd'hui répondre. Nous sommes ici. We are going to be voting yes today on this resolution for this reason, for humanity. We vote yes for humanity, not in the name of being able to solve all the problems of the world, because we cannot do that, but rather because we have to take the footsteps to peace, truth, justice, and reconciliation. And yes, sometimes we have to say difficult things, and we cannot avoid the facts and the reality of this situation. The Canadian poet Leonard Cohen put it this way: there are no perfect offerings. There's a crack. There's a crack in everything. But that's where the light gets in. Let us keep our eyes on the light, and let us face the time ahead in love and solidarity with one another. Despite our differences, we will get there. But we do it with honesty and with courage and with solidarity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Austria.
Mr. President, and thanks, Bob. I think Bob Ray is the best warm-up support act you can get here at the UN at the moment. You rule, Bob. Before I begin, let me express Austria's heartfelt condolences and sympathies to Linda and to the US colleagues on the passing of Secretary Madeleine Albright. She was a strong advocate for multilateral diplomacy and a role model for us here at the UN and for the world. Let me assure you that Austria also aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Colleagues, today we meet for a second time here in the GA to discuss the unprovoked, illegal and unjustified act of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Today we do so to discuss the devastating humanitarian consequences of the aggression. Thanks to UN reports, OCHA reports and briefings, we have a clear picture of the terrible humanitarian situation. People suffer unimaginable horrors in cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson. Bob mentioned many. Children suffer, as do the old, the sick, the disabled, those in healthcare centers, in institutions, in orphanages. We hear reports about attacks on civilian infrastructure with explosive weapons and about the use of cluster munitions in populated areas. We hear about shellings of healthcare facilities and schools, about hunger, about lack of medicine. We hear about acts that constitute war crimes that must be condemned in the strongest terms by all of us. International humanitarian law is not optional. We insist on its strict implementation by all of us. I have not heard a single voice here who argued that the suffering in Ukraine is necessary or justified. Dear colleagues, while the humanitarian conditions in Mariupol, Kharkiv and Kherson seem outside the scope of the imaginable for many, unfortunately, they are all too familiar. In parts of the Middle East, the Gulf or Africa, civilians suffer. In many instances, the Security Council has taken action. Even in politically difficult cases, the Council found a compromise. Not so regarding Ukraine. Here, the Security Council has been unable to act, failing its role as guardian of peace and security under the UN Charter. Clearly, when we start discussing the proposal on the new agenda for peace in our common agenda, including through humanitarian corridors or safe passages, and we need access for humanitarian personnel and aid. All of these points are reflected in the resolution that we will adopt shortly, which Austria will support, and hopefully most of you as well. There is a second resolution that has been put forward. This is the right of every state, and there's a lot in that second resolution that Austria also supports, but there are glaring omissions. And we already have a resolution presented by Ukraine that covers all relevant points. Moreover, it is unusual that this second draft was not consulted with the country that the resolution ensuring that it meets the approval of the country concerned. This is, after all, a humanitarian resolution. We are uniting here to support the suffering people of Ukraine and not to antagonize it. Colleagues, we heard about some of the consequences of the war of aggression against Ukraine. There are many concerns. As the world's breadbasket, the war in Ukraine threatens food security, particularly in vulnerable countries, including the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. And there are very real concerns regarding consequences of a potential nuclear fallout caused by an attack on the nuclear facility. All international norms in the field of nuclear security must be fully respected, and we support all efforts, in particular those of the IAEA and Director General Grossi, to ensure nuclear safety around Ukraine's nuclear facilities. And we must make best use of the upcoming conference on the physical protection of nuclear material that we have worked hard to strengthen. Yes, we must all do our part to help. We've heard of many humanitarian efforts and initiatives by the UN, by member states, and we commend those. Austria allocated over 17 million euros to support UNHCR, UNICEF, ICRC, NGOs, And we deployed a crisis team to Moldova to provide additional consular support and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine's immediate neighbors. Colleagues, when we think about what we can do, let's also be frank and factual here in this assembly. Like Bob, I'm puzzled when I hear colleagues arguing that we should avoid politicization, that we need to balance the text, that we need more neutral language. This is a humanitarian resolution, for goodness sake. This is about the suffering of people because of armed attacks and war crimes. How can that require balance and neutral language? Should we seek equidistance between victim and aggressor? Austria is a neutral state. We're not party to any military alliance. Our neutrality is embedded in our Constitution. Believe me, we know about neutrality. Neutrality does not mean neutrality of values, nor does it mean taking no position when faced with unprovoked, unjustified violations of international law. Like other neutral states, we take a clear stance. We speak up against violations of the law and humanitarian law, against violations of our UN Charter. We support efforts to hold those responsible for crimes. And we support clear language in our humanitarian resolution, in Ukraine's resolution, clear language that differentiates between victim and aggressor. Austria, therefore, urges you to vote in favor of this humanitarian resolution to show the world once again that the United Nations General Assembly continues to protect civilians, to defend the rule of law, and to uphold the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of this Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished representatives, the Sovereign Order of Malta conveys strength and purpose through dialogue to find a pathway to peace. The current fighting in Ukraine has caused the death of countless innocent civilians, destroyed civic infrastructure, ripped apart families, has forced nearly 4 million people to flee the country, while causing the internal displacement of up to 6 million individuals. We, an independent, neutral, sovereign entity state, providing global humanitarian aid in over 120 countries, we have provided considerable support, advice, and material help to the Ukrainian people, particularly during these 8 years of conflict. At this moment, our staff are currently serving in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, totaling over 5,000 personnel with tens of thousands of volunteers, doing everything from serving hot food and drink, caring for victims of injury and accident, providing first aid, medical assistance, counseling, emotional support, and securing short and long-term accommodations. Volunteers from locations away from the border, many of them from other countries, representing faith-based and community groups, have traveled to the region with supplies and humanitarian equipment, in some cases putting their own lives in danger. Our crisis response arm, Malteser International, and our national associations and relief corps are coordinating activities with regional and local government agencies, particularly within Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, Germany, and Austria, and with international aid organizations such as the Red Cross, the Order of St. John, and the Johanniter Orden, the UN agencies such as the UN High Commission for Refugees. We are also engaged in an international fundraising program to ensure that adequate resources continue to be available. However, the dire humanitarian situation inside Ukraine continues to deteriorate rapidly as densely populated areas such as the city of Mariupol are shelled incessantly with scenes of devastation reminiscent of World War II, and impacted civilian populations, from women and children to journalists, together with humanitarian and medical personnel. They all deserve the right to safety, along with secure, voluntary and unhindered passage. Those who have been able to escape the escalating violence in their homeland tell our volunteers on the ground that all they want is to go home in peace and security and resume their lives, send their children back to school, care for their aging relatives, their pets, and sit and breathe the air of freedom and peace. Yet still millions more await inside Ukraine in an atmosphere of uncertainty, even terror. These are the rural populations, the workers, the farmers, the agriculturalists, those whose efforts in wheat production in better times help feed millions of the world starving. Now they face the prospect of starving too, and they need our help, while the UN World Food Programme and millions across Africa and in other nations of the world desperately wait for a solution that will provide life-giving sustenance to the hungry. Mr. President, refugees and IDPs are especially vulnerable, and the Order of Malta expresses serious concerns at the heightened risk of sexual violence, especially trafficking in persons, which has already been observed from border locations, reported by numerous NGOs, the media, local police officials. To reduce the risk of human trafficking, effective assistance, protection, and clear advisories must be provided to refugees without discrimination. Adequate training needs to be provided to those providing advice and assistance, that these vulnerable women, children, and youth will not fall victim to this scourge. We appeal to all people of goodwill to assist in the protection of all refugees, IDPs, and persons in need, inside and outside of Ukraine. And we ask the UN community for compassion on behalf of the innocent. Distinguished delegates, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And with this, we have heard the last speaker on this item. Before we proceed to take a decision on draft resolutions A/ES11L2 and A/ES11L3, delegation wishing to make a statement in explanation of votes before the vote on any or both of these draft resolutions are invited to do so now in one intervention. Before giving the floor for explanation of votes, I would like to remind delegations that explanation of votes are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa is deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and its neighboring countries. It is vital that the United Nations General Assembly adopts a resolution responding to this humanitarian crisis and affirm the international humanitarian principles that the parties must abide by. Addressing the human situation should be our immediate priority. Unfortunately, instead of placing the humanitarian crisis and our response at the center of our deliberations, the political divisions in this assembly suggest that perhaps in the minds of some delegations, the humanitarian response is secondary to geopolitical objectives. While we should not ignore the context that gave rise to this crisis, and nor should we ignore any violations of the UN Charter and international law, that should not divert us, our focus, from what we ought to be immediately doing. Mr. President, what we should be doing as a matter of urgency is working as a global community to end the war by calling for a cessation of hostilities, as this is the first step in a comprehensive humanitarian response. This will create the necessary environment required for a political process that will lead to sustainable peace. Let us be clear, war has no winners. The real heroes are those that work towards peace. Through the last few decades, the world has continued to experience debilitating conflicts. Many of these wars have contravened the provisions of the Charter and international law. In one of these conflicts, the devastating war in Iraq, for example, over 2.4 million people are reported to have died since 2003. Many more civilians across the world have died and been displaced. Making this point today in our discussion on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is not a form of whataboutery. It is underscoring the point that many countries and their peoples suffer the consequences of wars that are not of their own doing. They have had no role to play in starting or ending those wars. In fact, we must make the point that in most cases, the vast majority of countries in this assembly have never invaded or colonized other countries, yet have suffered their consequences. There are few powerful countries that have been party to most of these conflicts, often in the form of proxy wars in other countries or regions. Africa has experienced its fair share of these proxy wars and their destructive outcomes. We therefore empathize with the people of Ukraine who find themselves caught up in a conflict not of their making. War and the use of force is never a solution to international disputes, irrespective of which countries are involved. Once war has begun, it is imperative that all of us work towards peace. It is for this reason that South Africa is of the view that right now we should be more concerned with ending the war and addressing the humanitarian plight of the people that are impacted by it. Mr. President, South Africa remains steadfast that an atmosphere of dialogue, mediation, and diplomacy is the only path to de-escalate the current conflict. In this regard, we reiterate our call for the good offices of the United Nations to mediate in pursuit of finding a sustainable solution, and for us as member states to facilitate an enabling environment for dialogue. Mr. President, in the backdrop of the deepening humanitarian crisis and the pursuit of peace not in sight, we ought to ask ourselves what matters the most. Our objective at this assembly must be to find a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace in Ukraine and addressing the humanitarian plight of those affected by the conflict. Resolution L2 of the cross-regional group unfortunately does not address this. South Africa supports several aspects of the resolution. We support the immediate cessation of hostilities, reaffirming the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, as well as the establishment of humanitarian corridors. We support that civilians, humanitarian personnel, vulnerable persons, including women and children, are fully protected. We support the call on all states and parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We support the voluntary, safe, and unhindered passage of civilians, including foreign nationals, without discrimination. Mr. President, there are, however, elements of the resolution that make the attainment of a General Assembly consensus difficult. At this stage, it remains imperative that all parties to the conflict are committed to humanitarian principles and a UN humanitarian response and be part of an outcome that we adopt. It is for this reason that South Africa saw the need to put forward a text which focused specifically on the humanitarian plight of those affected. Political issues that may lead to member states not agreeing to a text should be addressed elsewhere. We believe that an impartial humanitarian resolution should focus purely on addressing the humanitarian needs of those affected. It is in this context that we proposed a text that will first and foremost focus on calling for the cessation of hostilities as the first step towards ameliorating the humanitarian situation. A crucial aspect of our resolution also calls on all parties to abide by international humanitarian law as well as all protocols of the Geneva Conventions. It remains pivotal that aside from addressing the humanitarian needs of the people, it must also lay the foundation for the parties to engage in constructive and meaningful dialogue. South Africa's approach has been that in the current context of the conflict in Ukraine, it is necessary for the United Nations to adopt a resolution on the humanitarian situation affecting the people of Ukraine that is based on the principles that govern humanitarian assistance, namely humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles provide the foundations for humanitarian action and are central to establishing and maintaining access to those affected. An important aspect of this resolution must be to express concern at the humanitarian situation and call on all parties to abide by international humanitarian law. Mr. President, South Africa has explained to Ukraine the rationale for introducing its own draft resolution. South Africa will abstain on the resolution L2. We have tabled a resolution, L3, which we believe is more conducive for a comprehensive humanitarian response. Regarding action we will take this morning, it is crucial that all voices be heard and given an equal chance. There should be no attempt to muzzle those we see as different from ours. That will be cutting at the core of what this United Nations is about and undermining its basic tenets and setting precedents we will regret for years to come. Therefore, following the action by the Assembly on L2 this morning, South Africa formally requests that the Assembly should vote on L3. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of votes before the voting. Before the Assembly takes a decision on draft resolutions A/ES11L2 and AES11/L3, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for their adoption. In light of paragraph 2 and 3 of Article 18 of the Charter of the United Nations, if there is any objection to taking action on those draft resolutions by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting. Is there no objection? The two-thirds majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of the draft resolutions A, ES 11L2 and A, ES 11L3. As indicated by the President at the 7th plenary meeting yesterday morning, the Assembly will consider the two draft resolutions he has before it, taking into account Rule 91 of the Rules of Procedures of this General Assembly. Rule 91 states as follows: if two or more proposals relate to the same question, the General Assembly shall, unless it decides otherwise, vote on the proposal in the order which they have been submitted. The General Assembly may, after each vote on a proposal, decide whether to vote on the next proposal. Therefore, the Assembly will consider the draft proposal in the order in which they have been submitted. This means that the draft proposal that was submitted first, contained in the document A/ES11L2, will be considered first. The Assembly will now take action on the draft resolutions A/ES11L2 and A/ES11L3 one by one. We turn first to draft resolution A/ES11L2, entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES11/L2. Afghanistan, Andorra, Argentina, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Cambodia, Chile, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Israel, Jamaica, Kiribati, Liberia, Myanmar, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Peru, the Republic of Moldova, Samoa, Singapore, Suriname, Switzerland, Timor-Leste, Togo, and Tuvalu. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor E/ES11/L2, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. Malawi, that's it. Thank you, Mr. President.
A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor? Yeah, please signify. Those against and the abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting. The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES11/L2, entitled The Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 140. Against, 5. Abstention, 38. Draft Resolution AES 11/L2 is adopted. Okay, the representative of South Africa has requested the Assembly should also take action on draft resolution A/ES 11/L3. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Before I proceed with my statement, I need a clarification from the Secretariat. According to the Rule 91, the South Africa had to request the vote after the vote on the first resolution, and I want to know when did they request the vote?
Before we proceed, let's give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa requests that action be taken on the draft resolution, that voting be considered on our draft resolution. I thank you.
Ukraine, you have the floor.
That there was an attempt to confuse the General Assembly and not to follow the rules as they are. Therefore, before I make my proposal, I will explain why I will make a procedural proposal. The state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, of course of actions, especially as relating to decisions and attitude change. That is how the General Assembly is already perceived by peoples of the world, and it is called cognitive dissonance. The text L3, a twin brother of the defunct Russian draft, you see the similarities. The text L3, a twin brother of the defunct Russian draft in the Security Council, where Russia got just one vote in its support, is a ticket to a public perception defeat for this assembly. If one thinks that the L3 draft is about Ukraine, they are totally wrong. This text has never been a product of consultations with Ukraine, neither it is a product of cross-regional consultations, as was the case with the resolution just adopted by overwhelming majority. It is a text promoted unilaterally by one country, prompted by another country, that has not even cared to hide it. No matter what the result of action in the Assembly will be, if there is an action on L3, it will certainly mean further undermining of its authority, if not loss of the remainder of it. If this isn't compelling enough for you, because maybe the authority and image of this Assembly isn't that important to you, then let me offer you another analogy. Imagine you have a child dying in your arms, and instead of administering to him the proper medicine that may be bitter and with many side effects, but it is the one that gives at least a chance of saving the child, instead of that, you opt for a placebo. Nameless, generic, inexpensive one handed over to you by a big supplier. Will you opt for it? Will you leave the dying child with no chance whatsoever? Just because this nameless, generic pill was so easy to get and to swallow. Think about it. That is exactly what document L3 is. It's a fresh paint on the moldy, rotten structure of the Assembly, where the paint isn't actually paint, but the blood of Ukrainian children, women, and defenders. Let's spare the Assembly from this shame. Let's prove that the Assembly is still a solid structure, and we are the United Nations that have been wise enough to avert imminent disaster. So pursuant to Rule 91 of the General Assembly's Rules of Procedure, we propose that the General Assembly decide not to vote on the resolution proposed by South Africa. We urge all delegations to vote against the proposal of South Africa to go ahead with the next draft. But before that, I will ask Mr. President to explain it very carefully to all of us what the vote yes and no means, so there is no confusion, because the entire design of what happens is to spread confusion in the Assembly. Thank you.
The representative of Ukraine has objected the proposal that the General Assembly should consider draft resolution A/ES11L3, taking into account Rule 91 of the Rules of Procedure. Before I put the vote in place, the voting means against means here not to consider draft resolution L3. On the voting that we're going to have now.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have two proposals. The representative of South Africa has proposed that since the General Assembly adopted draft resolution L2, that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution L3. That was what the representative of South Africa said, including in her explanation of vote that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution L3. The representative of Ukraine just has objected to the proposal that the Assembly should consider draft resolution L3. And so we have to go to a vote, and those who consider that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution L3 will vote yes, and those who consider that the Assembly should not proceed to take action on draft resolution L3, so put draft resolution L3 to the side, those should vote no. Thank you.
Thank you for the correction, Secretariat. I shall now put to record vote the question whether the Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3. We shall now begin the voting process.
Wait, did you rest?
Oh.
Oh, we didn't start that.
Okay, before we proceed, Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Just judging by some of the chatter in the chamber, I just think it may be of assistance to delegates if the Secretariat again went through what the proposition is that is currently before the General Assembly and what voting yes would result in and what voting no would result in. This is a significant vote, and I just think it would be for the benefit of delegates just to hear again precisely what it is that we're voting on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me give the floor now to the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, я хочу обратить ваше внимание, что вы объявили голосование. Представитель секретариата объяснил нам, что означает это голосование. как известно, в соответствии с правилами процедуры Генеральной Ассамблеи, никто не может прерывать голосование, когда оно было объявлено председателем.
Well, let's move with the voting. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of proposal that the General Assembly should take action on draft resolution A, yes, 11L3, please signify. Those against, and abstentions, please.
The General Assembly is now voting on the proposal that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3. Those who consider that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 should vote yes. Those who consider that the Assembly should not proceed to take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 should vote no. Those who wish to abstain should press the button for abstention. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine. It's not a dot.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor 50, against 67, abstention 36. The proposal to take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 is not adopted. Since the proposal that the General Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 is not adopted, the Assembly will take no action on that draft. Before giving the floor for explanations of votes after the voting, may I remind delegations that the explanation of votes are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I will now give the floor. I will now give the floor to the representative of India. India, you have the floor.
Mr. President. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the ongoing situation which has rapidly been deteriorating since the beginning of the hostilities. The conflict has resulted in death of civilians, and nearly 10 million people have either been displaced internally or moved to neighboring countries. We have constantly called for cessation of hostilities. The humanitarian situation continues to worsen, particularly in the conflict zones in urban areas. Women, children, and elderly are disproportionately affected by the prolonging of this conflict. We reiterate our call for immediate ceasefire. There is an urgent need to address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the UN and its agencies. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs of the people of Ukraine, including through extending generous support to the Secretary General's flash appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan on Ukraine. India has already sent over 90 tons of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors as a part of the 9 separate tranches of humanitarian assistance delivered thus far. These supplies have included medicines and other essential relief material. We are in the process of sending further supplies in the coming days. India has ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. To that end, we initiated Operation Ganga involving 90 flights. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. Allow me to underscore that it is important that humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. Mr. President, we firmly believe efforts at the United Nations should contribute to de-escalation of the conflict, facilitate immediate cessation of hostilities to promote dialogue and diplomacy, and bring together parties to find an immediate end to the suffering of the people. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Mr. President, India abstained on the resolution since what we require now is to focus on cessation of hostilities and on urgent humanitarian assistance. The draft resolution did not fully reflect our expected focus on these challenges. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت تونس لصالح مشروع القرار المعروض اليوم على أنظار الجمعية العامة من منطلق ما توليه من أهمية بالغة للأوضاع الإنسانية ولضرورة التزام جميع الأطراف بتنفيذ مقتضيات القانون الدولي الإنساني، وكذلك تأكيدا لحرصها الثابت على الحفاظ على الأرواح والحق في الحياة والحماية والنفاذ إلى المساعدات وإنهاء المآسي الإنسانية التي تطال المدنيين الأبرياء وفي مقدمتهم الأطفال والنساء وكبار السن وذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة الذين هم أكثر ضحايا النزاعات وأول من يدفع ثمن الحروب من خلال شتى أنواع المعاناة التي تستمر آثارها وتداعياتها على امتداد أجيال. لقد أصبحت الأزمات الإنسانية المتفاقمة العلامة المميزة لمختلف النزاعات القائمة اليوم في العالم على غرار ما تشهده أوكرانيا، وبقدر ما نحيي جهود الأمم المتحدة ومنظمات الإغاثة الإنسانية للتخفيف من وطأة هذه الأزمات، فإننا نؤكد مجددا على أهمية تركيز الجهود على وقف الحرب ومساعدة الأطراف المعنية على التوصل إلى تسوية سلمية تضمن إعادة الأمن والاستقرار وتضع حدا لتدهور الأوضاع الإنسانية ولموجات اللجوء والتهجير الداخلي. ولا يفوتني هنا أن أشكر دول جوار أوكرانيا على جهودها في تخفيف هذه الأزمة وفي تسهيل المرور الآمن للطلبة والمقيمين في أوكرانيا. لقد كان الدافع الأساسي لإنشاء الأمم المتحدة هو إنقاذ الأجيال القادمة من ويلات الحروب التي شهدها العالم، واليوم وبعد مرور أكثر من 7 عقود على ذلك ما زال الملايين في عديد مناطق النزاع في العالم يواجهون القتل والإهانة والجوع والحصار وشتى أنواع الانتهاكات لحقوقهم الأساسية. وإذ نقدر حرص الدول الأعضاء على وضع حد لتدهور الأوضاع الإنسانية في أوكرانيا، فإننا كنا نتمنى أن تكون المجموعة الدولية أكثر انسجاما وأن تتكلم بصوت واحد، لا سيما في المسألة الإنسانية التي لا يمكن أن تكون محل اختلاف. كما نؤكد في هذا الإطار على أهمية أن لا تظل المجموعة الدولية تلتزم الصمت إزاء المعاناة الإنسانية لملايين اللاجئين والمهجرين والمحاصرين في بقية مناطق العالم ولا سيما في الشرق الأوسط وفي القارة الإفريقية، والتي يتواصل بعضها منذ عشرات السنين، وأن تتعاطى بنفس الالتزام وعلى أساس المقياس الواحد والقيم الإنسانية انسجاما مع مقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة ومبادئ القانون الدولي. في الختام، السيد الرئيس، تدعو بلادي إلى تكثيف الجهود الدولية من أجل حث أطراف النزاع على التوصل إلى تسوية سلمية لهذه الحرب التي تجاوزت تداعياتها من المنطقة لتشمل بقية العالم ولا سيما البلدان النامية التي أصبحت اليوم مهددة في أمنها الغذائي والطاقي، وهي لا تزال تعاني من التداعيات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية لجائحة كوفيد-19. شكرا.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, the Lao PDA is gravely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. My delegation commends all and supports all humanitarian efforts to assist the affected Ukrainian people and all foreign nationals. We applaud all countries and organizations which have extended swift humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Likewise, we believe that all parties and organizations concerned will continue to ensure safety and provide secure passage for the refugees in and around the conflict zones. The top priority for now is to prevent the situation from further escalating, while salvaging every glimpse of hope for an immediate and even permanent cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, my delegation voted abstention on the resolution L2 entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine because we believe that the General Assembly's resolution with humanitarian objective should be adopted by consensus, and the text should contain well-balanced and non-politicized language that would help to ease the tension and create conditions conducive for all humanitarian operations on the ground, in line with the fundamental principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, reaffirmed by GA Resolution 46/182 and 58/114. The urgency now is to seek political and diplomatic solution to the conflict, and we commend all ongoing efforts and peace negotiations between the parties concerned. Therefore, there is a dire need to refrain from any actions that could fuel the escalation of tension and hamper diplomatic efforts. Only diplomatic means will lead to the ceasefire agreement and allow unhindered humanitarian actions. We have already witnessed the negative consequences derived which could entail long-term impacts on innocent people in the region and the global community at large. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now we give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position after the vote we just had. Mr. President, we voted in favor of this resolution to firmly reiterate the position we expressed in the previous sitting on the situation in Ukraine. Mr. President, the substantive focus should be injected in pressing for achieving three main objectives: protection of civilians, humanitarian support, and dialogue. In this regard, Rwanda would have loved to see unity of all member states around a humanitarian resolution in this General Assembly. It's unfortunate that we see divisions when the lives of innocent civilians are at stake. Mr. President, the current and the crisis do not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it is generating human suffering. Therefore, Rwanda joins many other delegations in calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war and any mechanism that can bring peace. Diplomatic options present a better solution and sustainable peace. And in this regard, Rwanda calls for open dialogue and negotiations in good faith. A lasting solution will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, considering the concerns of both sides. Mr. President, similarly, the parties to this conflict should not make civilians the shields against gunfire, as it amounts to violations of international law. Finally, Mr. President, Rwanda calls for a sincere commitment to protection of civilians. The ongoing crisis poses severe pain to innocent civilians who are now uncertain of their future. We encourage both concerned parties to give a chance to peace. We wish to reiterate that the long-lasting solution to this current crisis is primarily in the hands of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. They have the key and the padlock. They can unlock it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you to the representative of Rwanda. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malaysia voted in favor of Resolution L2. We are deeply concerned with the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which Malaysia has been monitoring closely the development in and around Ukraine, including what is happening on the ground. Malaysia strongly urges all concerned parties to take immediate steps to de-escalate, continue dialogue and negotiations to prevent further loss of lives and devastation. We call for safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to those affected within and around Ukraine. We call for the respect for and protection of civilian life and infrastructure. Malaysia urges on all parties to fully comply with the obligation under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Mr. President, we also want to address what we witnessed today, whereby the Assembly had to look into two resolutions. On the two resolutions that were initially tabled before us, we saw similarities and merits in both texts. As such, if both were to be voted upon, we would have supported both texts by voting in favor. Malaysia is disappointed that the authors of both texts did not work together to reach an agreement on a singular text. Malaysia strongly feels that it is important to have a focused and balanced resolution that addresses the dire humanitarian situation on the ground. The tabling of two resolutions on the same issue today, including the need to address a procedural motion, does not convey the idea that the United Nations, that the international community itself is united in expressing solidarity for those who are affected by the humanitarian crisis. This is unfortunate. It was also glaring to note that there were no open-ended discussions with member states at large. We felt that there should be more open-ended consultations conducted so that the authors are able to engage with the larger membership of the UN in order to gain their views on the matter, especially since there were two resolutions on the same issue. Mr. President, Malaysia reiterates the inviolability of the fundamental principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country and peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security. We will continue to support international efforts to seek a peaceful and amicable solution to the conflict in the interest of maintaining regional and international peace and security, as well as promoting greater prosperity. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Господин председатель, я не буду сегодня обращаться к тем войнам, которые развязали те страны, которые сегодня требуют прекращения боевых действий, выдавая себя за миротворцев. Это те страны, которые 8 лет молчали о преступлениях, которые совершал киевский режим в отношении своих собственных граждан на Донбассе. И не только на Донбассе, а на всей Украине. Но я хотел бы обратиться к одной дате. Сегодня поминались даты. Поминалось 24 марта как месяц с начала специальной военной операции. Я хочу обратиться еще к одной дате. Сегодня еще одна годовщина. 24 марта 1999 года Соединенные Штаты и их союзники по НАТО начали вооруженную агрессию против Союзной Республики Югославии, которая продолжалась 78 дней и ночей. Силы Альянса осуществили более 35 тысяч боевых вылетов, выпустили около 3000 крылатых ракет, сбросили более 10 тысяч тонн взрывчатки. В тротиловом эквиваленте это в 5 раз превышает мощность атомной бомбы, сброшенной американскими военными на Хиросиму в 1945 году. В результате бомбардировок погибли свыше 2000 сербов, в том числе дети, женщины и люди преклонного возраста. Позже их цинично назовут сопутствующим ущербом. Оказались разрушены тысячи гражданских объектов в десятках городов. Автономный край Косово был силой отторгнут от страны. Агрессия НАТО 1999 года против Югославии стала первым вооруженным нападением в Европе на суверенное государство после 1945 года. Такой вот трагический вклад в европейскую историю внес, как они себя называют, сугубо оборонительный блок НАТО. Я могу привести и другие примеры. Сегодня они говорили, выступавшие в этом зале. Господин председатель, я думаю, не стоит долго вдаваться в причины того, почему Россия проголосовала против представленного западными странами и Украиной проекта псевдогуманитарной резолюции. Почему псевдо? Потому что она была нужна ее авторам исключительно для того, чтобы еще раз осудить Россию и навесить на нас различные ярлыки, провести своего рода перекличку тех, кто готов подписаться под однобокой трактовкой ситуации. Признательны всем тем, кто нашел в себе мужество независимо взглянуть на происходящее. Псевдогуманитарным этот проект можно считать еще и потому, что если бы наши западные коллеги пеклись о гуманитарных вопросах, они поддержали бы принятие вчера в Совете Безопасности ООН российского действительно гуманитарного проекта. Однако политические соображения взяли вверх. В итоге гуманитарщики на земле оказались без важных для них решений, и принятый Генеральной Ассамблеей проект этого компенсировать никак не сможет. Кроме того, нельзя не отметить, что под беспрецедентным давлением западных стран Генассамблея вновь вышла за пределы своих полномочий, пытаясь давать предписания по вопросам поддержания международного мира и безопасности в нарушение положения пункта 2 статьи 11 Устава ООН. Подобные предписания, принятые ультравирус, ничтожны и абы ничего, не создают никаких правовых последствий. Подобные предписания, принятые ультравирус, ничтожны, null and void, и абы ничего не создают никаких правовых последствий. Legal consequences. Сожалеем, что из-за недостойной площадки ООН процедурной возни, которую западные страны устроили для недопущения голосования по проекту резолюции, представленному нашими коллегами из ЮАР, слишком велики были опасения наших западных коллег столкнуться с ситуацией, когда их присвоенная самим себе монополия на выдвижение в Генеральной Ассамблее проектов решений по ситуации на Украине, причем выдержанных исключительно в антироссийском духе, оказалась бы подорванной. Поступив таким образом, инициаторы этой возни сами себя разоблачили, а также те страны, которые были готовы поддержать их проект. Полагаем, что члены ООН запомнят преподанный нашими западными коллегами урок манипулирования гуманитарными принципами. Благодарю вас.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
First of all, I would like, on behalf of Algerian mission, to express to the U.S. government and to our colleagues, members of U.S. mission, my deepest condolence and my sincere compassion following the sad loss of Her Excellency Mrs. Madeleine Albright, U.S. Secretary of State, former U.S. Secretary of State, who was very close to my country, Algeria, and with whom we had worked closely to reach peace agreement signed in Algiers in December 2000, which put an end to the war between brotherly countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea. Coming back to the explanation of Algerian vote, إن الجزائر تعرب عن قلقها البالغ إزاء تدهور الأزمة في أوكرانيا وتداعياتها على الأوضاع الإنسانية التي أصبحت تشكل واقعاً مأساوياً يفرض أكثر من أي وقت مضى على الجميع التقيد بالقواعد والمبادئ الأساسية للقانون الدولي الإنساني التي تحدد الالتزامات الدولية في هذا المجال، لا سيما اتفاقيات جنيف لسنة 1949 والبروتوكول الإضافي لسنة 1977 والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان. وفي هذا الصدد تدعو الجزائر مجلس الأمن الاطلاع بمسؤولياته الأساسية لصيانة الأمن والسلم الدوليين والتعاون من أجل السلام العالمي وفقاً لميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وتود الجزائر التأكيد مجدداً تمسكها الثابت بمبادئ وأهداف ميثاق الأمم المتحدة وقواعد القانون الدولي القائمة على احترام سيادة الدول واستقلالها وسلامة أراضيها في كنف الاحترام المتبادل للالتزامات الدولية والضمانات الأمنية. كما تؤكد بلاد الجزائر على أهمية تضافر الجهود الدبلوماسية من أجل وضع حد للأزمة الإنسانية الراهنة في أوكرانيا وعلى دعمها للمساعي والجهود الهادفة إلى تخفيف حدة التوتر من خلال انتهاج لغة الحوار والمفاوضات باعتبارها السبيل الوحيد لحل الأزمة ووقف إراقة المزيد من الدماء والتكفل بالوضع الإنساني المأساوي دون التعاطي بمقاييس مختلفة مع المعاناة الإنسانية بما يحقق عودة الأمن والاستقرار وسلامة دول المنطقة وشعوبها. I'll thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil voted in favor of the resolution adopted here today because of the urgent need for the United Nations to send a strong message on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The General Assembly could not become a bystander while the world witnesses the swift transformation of once peaceful cities into war zones, with shocking images from the conflict and the desperation of thousands of civilians trapped in the battlefield, with no food, no water, and no electricity. No, the dire situation on the ground demanded a swift reaction from us. However, we deeply regret that the General Assembly was not able to speak with one voice today, promoting compliance with international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are objectives that should unite rather than divide us. Brazil would have strongly preferred a consensual text, resulting from effective, transparent, and inclusive negotiations, rather than a fait accompli, a draft resolution that was not open to negotiation and whose language contained clearly divisive elements, many of which going beyond the humanitarian aspects of the conflict.
Its own resolution, you have to ask the South Africans why they thought it was necessary to submit a competing resolution.
Will this have an impact on the ground?
Absolutely. Absolutely will have an impact on the ground because it's going to give encouragement to the Ukrainian people. But even more importantly, I think it identifies for all of us what we need to do to support Ukraine with humanitarian assistance. The U.S. is, of course, one of the largest humanitarian contributors to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Our humanitarian assistance is at about $600 million now, and we will continue to look for opportunities to provide support to the Ukrainians and encourage others to do so. And this resolution is one way of doing that. Thank you all. You sure can.
Thank you. Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York. Madam, it is a kind of follow-up because it is a success, 140, yes, but you did increase the support for a resolution. And what you will say to the countries that are keeping abstaining or are not supporting what the majority of the countries at the UN are supporting?
First of all, there's really no difference between 141 and 140. But what I say and what I said to the countries who abstained previously is that there is no neutral ground here. We're watching every day what is happening in Ukraine. And we have to stand with the Ukrainian people. And for whatever reasons, countries are deciding that they can abstain, they can remain neutral. All they need to do is look at the situation on the ground, look at the devastation, look at Mariupol. It's been, the buildings are all being attacked. Look at the large numbers of Ukrainians who have been forced from their homes. More than 3.5 million have crossed the border, but up to 10 million total, including that 3 million, have been forced out of their homes. There's no neutral ground. Thank you.
Can I ask a question about the open meeting you've requested for North Korea ICBM missile launch?
All I can say is that we requested the open meeting, and we look forward to having an open discussion of that tomorrow.
Ambassador, what's next for the U.S. regarding Ukraine?
Ending the war. That is West Texas.
action on a draft presented by a member state that took nothing away from the earlier draft and could have coalesced a greater number of members around the humanitarian needs of Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. سيد الرئيس، تود مصر أن تؤكدوا على النقاط التالية اتصالا بالقرار الذي تم اعتماده اليوم حول الوضع الإنساني في أوكرانيا، والذي صوتت مصر لصالحه انطلاقا من تمسكها بقواعد القانون الدولي الإنساني لحماية المدنيين في النزاعات المسلحة. 1. ينبغي التزام كافة الأطراف بعدم تسييس العمل الإنساني الدولي والقرارات ذات الصلة، وتعبر مصر عن عدم الارتياح إزاء تشدد البعض في التفاوض على مشروعات القرارات الإنسانية والذي يقوض فرص التوافق المنشود. 2. تجدد مصر رفضها لمنهج توظيف العقوبات الاقتصادية خارج إطار آليات النظام الدولي متعدد الأطراف لما لها من آثار بالغة على معاناة المدنيين والإضرار كذلك بالاقتصاد العالمي برمته والذي لم يتعافى بعد من آثار الجائحة. 3. تشير مصر في ذلك السياق أيضا إلى أن استمرار النزاع أثر بالسلب بالفعل على أسعار الواردات الغذائية والطاقة، وبات مهددا لانسيابية التجارة الدولية والاستقرار في أسواق الغذاء العالمية، وهو أمر يتعين إلى الأولوية المناسبة والعاجلة للتعامل معه دولياً ومشاطرة الأعباء الواقعة على الدول المستوردة للغذاء في ذلك السياق. وإذ تشدد مصر على ضرورة تحلي كل الأطراف بمسؤولياتها ذات الصلة بتدفق المساعدات الإنسانية لكل المتضررين وكفالة عبور المقيمين الأجانب للحدود دون تمييز وعبر كل الخطوط، فإنها تؤكد في الوقت ذاته أن البحث عن حل سياسي سريع لإنهاء الأزمة في أسرع وقت وبما يخاطب شواغل ومصالح كل أطرافها وجذور الأزمة ذاتها يجب أن يتصدر أولويات المجتمع الدولي بأسره أيضا، وفي القلب منه منظومة الأمم المتحدة. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. عانى بلد العراق من الحروب في العقود القليلة الماضية، ويعرف الشعب العراقي تماما ماذا تعني الحاجة الملحة للمساعدات الإنسانية في أوقات الأزمات والحروب، حيث قدمت لنا الأمم المتحدة والشركاء والأصدقاء الدعم الإنساني الكامل المطلوب لتجاوز تداعيات الأزمات ذات الصلة. ومن هذا المنطلق ولشعورنا بالمسؤولية تجاه الشعب الأوكراني دعمنا القرار A/ES-11/L2 الرامي إلى تقديم وتعزيز المساعدات الإنسانية للمحتاجين في أوكرانيا، وكنا سندعم مشروع القرار A/ES-11/L3 المقدم من قبل جنوب أفريقيا لو أتيحت الفرصة له. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now let's give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
President, the delegation of Sierra Leone adds its voice to the rest of the speakers before us to express our deepest sympathy and most sincere and heartfelt condolences to the government and people of the United States of America through the United States mission to the United Nations on the passing away yesterday of former Secretary of State, Her Excellency Madeleine Albright, who happens to have been a great friend of Sierra Leone. I say so because in 1999, when the war was raging in my country, the then Secretary of State visited our country in support of peace and reconciliation to speak with our leaders. That act will never be forgotten. We are eternally grateful, and may her gentle soul rest in perfect peace. That said, Mr. President, the delegation of Sierra Leone has asked for the floor to explain its position on our vote on the resolution just adopted. In our explanation of vote after the vote on the resolution ES11/2 of 2nd March 2022, Sierra Leone expressed grave concern over the regrettable serious situation created in Ukraine with ramifications for regional and international peace and security. We expressed grave concern over the growing refugee and humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. We called for and reiterated our call for equal treatment for all those seeking safety and refuge, and that there must be meaningful action on this call for equal treatment with dignity for all those fleeing or directly affected by the conflict without discrimination, particularly on the basis of race or immigration status. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine and therefore voted in favor of the resolution. Over our vote on resolution ES11/2 of 2nd March 2022 was based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter, its principles and purposes, and the principles and purposes of the United Nations. We proceeded to emphasize the need for consistency and good faith in application of the Charter principles and international law, and at the same time not absolving the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. Similarly, Mr. President, on principle basis, we recognize that humanitarian resolutions are meant to enable the delivery of humanitarian assistance in accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. In this regard, we have been guided in our vote by the framework agreed by this General Assembly in Resolution 46/182 of 1991. We have accorded appropriate consideration to the principle to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of states in accordance with the United Nations Charter and the need for humanitarian assistance to be provided with the consent of the affected states. Our vote this morning is therefore in the light of the accepted principles in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating our call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and urge for the continuation of the ceasefire talks, setting the path for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia expresses our deep condolences to the people and government of the United States on the passing of Secretary Madeleine Albright. May her soul rest in peace. We thank the delegation of Ukraine, France, and Mexico, together with the core group, as well as the delegation of South Africa for their initiatives. Indonesia voted in favor for the resolution because of the need for action to address the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine. However, Indonesia deeply regrets that the General Assembly was not able to speak with a strong and united voice, which is urgent and required at the moment, as it manifests our commitment to save lives. However, consensus has been increasingly difficult and a luxury in the General Assembly, even on a matter as important as the humanitarian issues. Indonesia deeply regrets that the world had to see today how divided we are. The United Nations is in a matter of such great importance. We were presented with 2 draft resolutions addressing identical issues. While this stems usually from the absence of political will, it is not the case on this issue. Indeed, we saw a strong political will from all members to address the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. However, we view that the lack or unwillingness to have inclusive consultation and dialogue amongst ourselves is at fault. Indonesia believes that it is imperative for all parties to always sit together and try to iron out differences and achieve delicate balance. Taking into consideration the importance of the issue at stake, we were ready to vote in favor for both resolutions because we believe that despite our differences, our ultimate objective must be to save people's lives. We regret today that we have seen unfolding of events to prevent all proposals to be considered equally. We hope moving forward we can do better to uphold the democratic spirit of the General Assembly. Mr. President, every day we continue to witness the worsening humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. The impact is also now being felt by innocent civilians in many least developed and developing countries with the increasing price of basic food commodities. Should this continue to persist, we might have to deal with a humanitarian crisis that at a bigger scale. We therefore reiterate our call to stop the war. It is crucial to urgently de-escalate hostilities to allow access for humanitarian assistance. We also need to allow safe passage for civilians fleeing from Ukraine. But more importantly, we believe that it is urgent that we push for a perpetual peace. To this end, we need to focus on rebuilding trust instead of discord, so that the political settlement could yield positive outcome that pave the way for this way to stop this perilous war. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Eritrea.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Okay. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of position after the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L2. The draft resolution just adopted regrettably makes reference to the resolution adopted on the 2nd March, which my delegation voted against. Eritrea is disappointed that the humanitarian issue is politicized. Eritrea rejects any politicization of humanitarian issue as it undermines action geared towards addressing core humanitarian situation of affected peoples and countries. Had the text presented for the consideration of the General Assembly focused on humanitarian priorities only, it could have been possible to adopt the text by consensus, garnering a much stronger and united voice on humanitarian principles that matter most within the context of the agenda item that we have been discussing for the last 2 days. Eritrea appreciates the initiative of South Africa, and Eritrea was prepared to support the L3 tabled by South Africa. In the consideration of humanitarian assistance, it is important that the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence is upheld, and all humanitarian actions are guided by the full respect of these principles. Despite the geopolitical differences between US-led NATO and Russia, which is having grave humanitarian consequences for Ukraine, Eritrea wishes to stress that all parties to the conflict take concrete steps to respect their obligation under international humanitarian principles to ensure that all civilians and nationalities, including African nationals, are fully respected and protected. It is important to make every effort possible to minimize humanitarian consequences for the civilian population. The unfolding humanitarian situation demands agreeing on a ceasefire and achieving humanitarian pause to ensure safe, rapid, voluntary, and unhindered evacuation of civilians. While the task of humanitarian assistance is ongoing, there should be an earnest effort on the political track to end the conflict, and in this regard, Eritrea wishes to reiterate its call for the peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. Finally, on a more serious political note, the current campaign or drive to go back to a unipolar world order, I quote, tightening the noose on Russia, end of quote, is becoming more dangerous and risky military confrontation, which runs contrary to the fundamental pillars of robust multilateralism, as well as the lofty aspirations of the majority of the world's people and nations. We must remain guided by the UN Charter in the full respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states for a peaceful world order. In this tumultuous period of great uncertainty, Eritrea wishes peace to Ukraine and Russia, as well as to the rest of the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand joins previous speakers in expressing our deepest condolences to the government and the permanent mission of the U.S. On the sudden passing of the former Secretary of State, Madame Madeleine Albright. May her soul rest in eternal peace. Mr. President, Thailand voted in support of the resolution because of the overriding importance that we attach to the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and persons in vulnerable situations. Our support of the resolution underlies our deep concerns for the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We urge all parties to fully comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to protect civilians and civilian objects, as well as ensure unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance without discrimination and politicization. In this regard, we commend Ukraine's neighboring countries and other states which have quickly mobilized humanitarian assistance to those in need. On our part, Thailand reaffirms our responsibility to the collective global efforts to alleviate the plight of the affected civilians. We have provided humanitarian assistance, including food, medical, and other essential supplies, to the affected civilians through the Ukrainian Red Cross Society. The only way to reduce the humanitarian consequences of the crisis is the peaceful settlement of dispute. We continue to hope for progress in the bilateral dialogue between the concerned parties and all efforts of peaceful settlement of the situation. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. Let me give the floor now to the permanent representative of Jordan.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. صوت الأردن لصالح مشروع القرار L2 انطلاقا من موقفه الداعي لاحترام أحكام القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني ومبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. يدعو الأردن كافة أطراف النزاع لوقف إطلاق النار والانخراط في مفاوضات فاعلة من أجل عودة السلام والاستقرار، وبما يؤدي إلى إنهاء المعاناة الإنسانية التي نشأت عن الأزمة وإلى عودة اللاجئين. كما يدعو الأردن أطراف النزاع للتقيد بالتزاماتهم بموجب القانون الدولي الإنساني واجبة التطبيق أثناء النزاعات المسلحة، بما في ذلك عدم استهداف المدنيين والمنشآت المدنية، والالتزام بمبدأ الحرص بما يقي المدنيين من ويلات الحرب. كما لا بد للأطراف أن تعمل على حماية المدنيين والعاملين في المجال الإنساني، وأن تسمح بدخول المساعدات الإنسانية دون عوائق أو شروط. وأن توفر ممرات آمنة للمدنيين للخروج من المدن وبؤر النزاع. يدعم الأردن الجهود الدبلوماسية المبذولة ودور الأمم المتحدة في الوصول إلى حل سياسي وسلمي ومستدام للنزاع، بما يحمي المصالح المشروعة لجميع الأطراف ويحفظ لأوكرانيا سيادتها واستقلالها ووحدتها وسلامتها الترابية. على الرغم من تصويت الأردن لصالح مشروع القرار L2، فإنه يؤكد على أهمية التقصي وفحص أي ادعاءات بارتكاب خروقات للقانون الدولي الإنساني، حيث أن المسؤولية الدولية من مختلف جوانبها لا تنشأ بشكل مسبق، وإنما نتيجة الانتهاك الفعلي والموثق لأحكام قانون النزاعات المسلحة. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mr. President, my delegation abstained from voting on the draft resolution L2. We reiterate our position on the current conflict as explained during the meeting of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly held on 2nd March 2022. The Islamic Republic of Iran is deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. Iran reiterates its principled position regarding the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and underlines the necessity of full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected, and the safety and security of all civilians and civilian infrastructures must be guaranteed. Iran reiterates its call for the urgent cessation of hostilities and the escalation of tensions in the current conflict and encourages all parties to pursue their concerns through dialogue. We support the ongoing negotiations between the parties and reiterate our call for an urgent peaceful resolution of the conflict in accordance with international law. Mr. President, we believe that the resolution just adopted by the General Assembly contains certain elements that go beyond the scope of the humanitarian situation on the ground and lacks realistic mechanisms for dealing with the humanitarian aspects of the conflict. The Islamic Republic of Iran emphasizes that the humanitarian nature of assistance must always be upheld and that the provision of humanitarian assistance shall only be guided by the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. Iran urges all parties to cooperate in advancing humanitarian response to the situation, and in this regard emphasizes the need for the provision and effective delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in need, including the refugees. We call for the immediate facilitation of safe, voluntary, and dignified transfer of all civilian refugees and IDPs from conflict-affected areas. Humanitarian issues have a prominent place in Iran's foreign policy. We once again express our readiness to cooperate, coordinate, and facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need in the current conflict. In this context, we commend the continued efforts by the Secretary General, the UN agencies to deliver humanitarian aid as well as assistance and protection for refugees. Finally, Mr. President, my delegation regrets that member states were not given a chance to vote on the draft resolution L3 focused on humanitarian issues which are urgently needed now. Had the draft resolution L3 put to the vote, my delegation would have voted in favor of it. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
Mr. President, allow me to express our deepest condolences on the passing of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright was a great leader, a trailblazer, most importantly, a role model for so many women in diplomacy and foreign policy, including me. I personally knew her as a great champion of freedom and democracy around the world, including in Lebanon. Mr. President, we just adopted a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Lebanon voted yes on this resolution. We wish a resolution on this important matter was adopted by consensus, and this General Assembly was united behind it. Colleagues, friends, now what? Where do we go from here? Is this resolution going to be implemented? Is it more important to score successes in voting than making real progress on the ground, helping the traumatized children and women who are looking for us to stop this war? How safer are the civilians in Ukraine because of the resolution today? How closer are we to a solution? How closer are we to peace today? Mr. President, we are failing in our duty to stop the scourge of war. We are failing the civilians in Ukraine. We are failing the world that's standing now at the abyss of a food crisis and the prospect of hunger and famine. This war is reverberating across the world, especially in least developed and vulnerable countries that have not yet recovered from the pandemic and the financial crisis. Mr. President, it's high time for an immediate cessation of hostilities. It's high time to alleviate the humanitarian plight of civilians, especially children and women, who continue to worsen by the day. It's high time to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, as enshrined in Article 1, Para 3 of the Charter. In this regard, we reiterate our call for a peaceful solution of this conflict through diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiations. I want to echo what my sister Mato, the ambassador of South Africa, just said in her statement. War has no heroes. Real heroes are those who work towards peace. The failure to stop a war in Europe 76 years ago led to an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths in World War II. We have to do everything in our capacity to stop this war and make sure it does not devolve into a wider war. We in Lebanon know very well the price of war and the consequences of inaction on lives and livelihoods, not in one country, but around the world. I call on all my colleagues here to act as heroes for peace and to embark today, as we get out of this hole, on a new path towards a consensual resolution that unites us around peace. Mr. President, the General Assembly clapped today at the adoption of this resolution. I think the real celebration and triumph is when we vote for the stopping of this war and end the misery of the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Lesotho.
Lesotho voted in favor of draft resolution L2. The yes vote has been motivated by deep desire for humanitarian action to immediately come into place, primarily for the people of Ukraine and other nationalities suffering as a result of the situation in their country. Fundamentally, therefore, the vote for Lesotho is focused on humanitarian action as opposed to causes of the conflict or any other factors that may escalate or fuel that lead to further suffering of these people. We do hope that passing of this resolution focus will be on humanitarian action. As in the last vote on 2nd of March, Lesotho's position was principled on respect of the UN Charter, respect for humanitarian law, respect for territorial integrity for nations. We pray that we see cessation of hostilities and a resolution of conflict by peaceful means and restoration of peace in that region. I thank you.
Thank you. We have heard the last speaker in the explanation of vote after the vote. Now we will hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France on behalf of the European Union and 27 countries.
Monsieur le Président, nous venons d'adopter une résolution sur la situation humanitaire en Ukraine. Il s'agit d'un texte équilibré qui reflète fidèlement la situation désastreuse sur le terrain. Il rappelle l'urgence de mettre un terme à la catastrophe humanitaire et de respecter le droit international humanitaire. Il demande à la Russie de mettre fin sans délai à son agression. Ce texte, qui est le résultat d'une large consultation avec l'Ukraine et les États membres de toutes les régions, a été coparrainé par 80 pays. Il a été adopté à une majorité écrasante. C'est un signal très fort envoyé par cette Assemblée. L'Ukraine et le peuple ukrainien en ont besoin. C'est aussi la raison pour laquelle l'Union européenne et ses États membres ont soutenu la demande procédurale de l'Ukraine. Nous devons plus que jamais être unis derrière les principes universels de la Charte des Nations Unies et du droit international humanitaire. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries.
Mr. President, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and of course my own country, Denmark. Today we voted not to take action on the South African resolution titled The Humanitarian Situation in Ukraine. Let me be clear. In general, the South African resolution included messages and principles that we, as steadfast defenders of the humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law, are supportive of. Yet the decision to vote not to take action on the South African resolution was not difficult, for reasons already stated, but bears repeating. First, our problem with the text was less so what was in it, but what was not in it. It only mentioned Ukraine. Yet Russia alone bears responsibility for the humanitarian catastrophe we are discussing today. Only Russia can end it. The responsibility is clear, and the message we send from the General Assembly must be just as clear. And second, our problem with the text was not who was behind it, but who was not behind it. As UN member states, we have a strong tradition for engaging on humanitarian crises together with the country of concern. And the sponsors of the South African resolution are among the strongest defenders of this principle. It was therefore particularly regrettable that the resolution was drafted without the engagement of Ukraine, and even more so that it was tabled in competition to the humanitarian resolution put forward by a cross-regional group of countries together with Ukraine, a resolution which was adopted by an overwhelming majority of this General Assembly. Mr. President, it does not take much imagination for any of us to put ourselves in the place of our Ukrainian colleagues. Your country is invaded, your people is living through a humanitarian disaster. How would you expect the UN to act? Would you expect and insist to be consulted? If the answer is yes, your conclusion can only be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And as Nordic Baltic countries, we are grateful that this too was the message of the General Assembly today. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Israel ascribes great importance to allowing for the provision of unhindered humanitarian assistance. We are of the view that the utmost effort should be undertaken to avoid civilian casualties, especially vulnerable populations, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. It is for these reasons that Israel voted in favor of Resolution L2, which should be read in accordance with the obligation of all sides under international law as applicable. Israel remains gravely concerned by the growing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and is doing its utmost to provide aid to those in need. We have normative, historical, and ethical obligations to be part of the humanitarian efforts. In that regard, Israel has already provided over 100 tons of humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine, including medical supplies, generators, water purification systems, emergency water supply kits, and winter gear. Just yesterday, Israel inaugurated the Shining Star Field Hospital in western Ukraine. As the head of the Israeli delegation noted at the inauguration ceremony, Israel hopes to light the path of refugees in need of medical care. We will extend a helping hand to them, as has always been the state of Israel's custom in such humanitarian crises. Israel reiterates its call for de-escalation and for dialogue. In view of our positive relations with both parties, we are assisting in the mediation efforts to stop this tragic war. We hope and pray for a peaceful resolution of this crisis, rather than more needless suffering and bloodshed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to the Observer State of the Holy See.
Mr. President, the Holy See welcomes the adoption of the draft resolution, Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine, by this 11th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation is pleased to see that the draft resolution, with such clarity, deplores the dire humanitarian consequences of the conflict, expresses grave concern at the deteriorating humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, reaffirms the need to protect the safety, dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms without any kind of discrimination of people fleeing the conflict and violence, strongly condemns any attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects, and stresses the particular impact that armed conflict has on women, children, including as refugees and internally displaced persons, and other civilians who have specific needs, including persons with disabilities and older persons. Furthermore, my delegation welcomes that the resolution recognizes the manifold consequences of the conflict, including increased food insecurity globally, and the potential impacts of a possible accident resulting from bombing and shelling of the Ukrainian nuclear infrastructures. Addressing the pilgrim in St. Peter's Square yesterday morning, Pope Francis spoke in remembrance of the many victims of the conflict, recalling that there is no victory in war. Rather, everything is lost in war, which is nothing else than a self-destructive defeat of humanity. In the face of the death and suffering caused by the conflict, the Holy See reiterates its call for an immediate ceasefire, the establishment and respect for humanitarian corridors, and to advance a real and decisive focus on negotiations towards, in the words of the adopted text, the immediate peaceful resolution of the conflict. The gratitude of the Holy See is extended once more to all, from states to individuals, who have opened their homes and hearts to those fleeing the conflict, to all who provide food, clothing, and medicines to those in need, and to all who labor for putting an end to this conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. We have heard the last speaker on this item. In accordance with the terms of paragraph 14 of the draft resolution A/ES11L2, which the Assembly has adopted, the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is temporarily adjourned.
starting out, young families, people who need to get a home and they can't do a job. It's tough.
Payments away from the end. I'm like, oh my God.
That's nice. You need to have a, they used to have my dad, my mom talk about mortgage earning mortgage. Oh. I said, what's that? He says, when you paid off the mortgage, you never got the paper. And they would have a little card and they had to burn it because they didn't have to pay it.
Oh, no.
And they called it mortgage earning mortgage. So they had the title earning.
Title earning.
I don't have to pay him anymore. Just have a little party. Here's money. I don't have to pay this guy anymore.
Why now?
But that was a big thing in the 50s and 60s. The mortgage earning card. We're down the house.
Or the other thing is, what happens if there's a discrepancy and you know, well, supposed to be a part. I burned it.
Hey, Esau. Who wins the lottery here?
Hey. Let's go.
You got here on the consultations. Wait, just finished.
ECOSOC is in the afternoon at 3 p.m. Yeah, I have nothing scheduled for Security Council. We heard something about it. Yeah, they just said ECOSOC.